The folded sheet of paper drifted onto the mahogany desk without making a single sound. Senator John Kennedy kept his vocal volume entirely unchanged. He peered at Nancy Pelosi over the upper rim of his reading spectacles and stated with agonizing deliberation, "Madam Speaker, I possess only a single inquiry for you today, and I am entirely certain you're going not to appreciate it." On the opposite side of the chamber, her fingers tightened around the perimeter of her personal files and halted. The broadcasting equipment remained strictly focused. The C-SPAN network refused to alter its angle. An estimated audience of 2 million citizens was prepared to witness the events of the ensuing minutes, and absolutely no one among them would possess the willpower to divert their gaze. Rewind exactly 4 minutes prior. Hearing room 1100 inside the Longworth building was completely filled, stretching all the way to the rear boundary. The House Ethics Committee had convened an open inquiry regarding the Stop Insider Trading Act, and for the initial time in several months, the observation deck was overflowing with citizens who had used their personal time off to witness the proceedings. Journalists crowded the lateral walkways. A crimson indicator illuminated on the primary C-SPAN lens positioned above the presiding official's position. Somewhere across the nation, upwards of 300,000 individuals were tuned into the digital broadcast, and that figure was rapidly escalating. Nancy Pelosi was seated at the testimony desk dressed in an ivory-toned ensemble. Tranquil, collected, arguably the most influential female figure in the chronicles of American governance. She had outlasted 8 presidential administrations. She possessed the ability to tally legislative support in ways no peer could replicate. She exhibited zero signs of anxiety. Instead, she carried the demeanor of an individual who possessed far more important engagements. Her aide had placed a solitary tumbler of water near her arm, alongside a leather portfolio perfectly aligned before her. She had refrained from interacting with either object. She had consented to this appearance simply because it carried zero political penalty. She was departing the legislative branch having already declared her intention to step away from seeking an additional term. There existed no impending legislation for adversaries to leverage against her, no panel assignments left to revoke, no hierarchical positions she still coveted. Psychologically, she had already exited the arena, viewing herself as an impending historical painting on a granite corridor. This inquiry was merely a procedural annoyance she would endure for 60 minutes and dismiss before her evening meal. That was the specific detail regarding Nancy Pelosi that observers consistently miscalculated, and it was the singular element John Kennedy was relying upon. She operated under the assumption that she possessed nothing left to forfeit. An individual harboring that belief inherently ceases to exercise caution. The presiding official yielded the floor to the representative from Louisiana. John Kennedy expressed his gratitude, consumed a modest amount of hydration, and intertwined his fingers. When he finally vocalized, his southern cadence saturated the chamber, like heated molasses poured at a deliberate pace. "Madam Speaker, I extend my gratitude for your attendance. I am well aware you are an occupied individual. I shall attempt to avoid monopolizing your afternoon schedule." A smattering of individuals chuckled softly. Pelosi provided a narrow, enduring smirk, the facial expression of a person humoring an infant. She had faced artificial, folksy behavior previously. Rural charisma was merely a strategic illusion, and she was intimately familiar with every strategy within this institution, having personally engineered a substantial portion of them. In the elevated seating behind her rested a sequence of everyday citizens the panel had selected to attend. A former academic instructor from Ohio, a diner proprietor from the outskirts of Scranton who had narrowly avoided bankruptcy in 2020, and a youthful military veteran occupying a mobility device near the pathway. They had not traveled here for entertainment. They were present because the fundamental issue at hand was whether the identical regulations that devastated their lives were enforced upon the individuals drafting them. They remained remarkably motionless. "I desire to discuss financial capital," Kennedy articulated. "More precisely, your personal capital. And I wish to commence with a statement you generated your own self." He directed his gaze downward at the creased document, then elevated his eyes once more. "During the year 2021, a journalist questioned you regarding whether legislative members should be actively exchanging equities while simultaneously constructing the statutes. And you responded, and I am directly quoting your phrasing here, 'We are a free market economy.' Does that ring a bell for you?" It resembles terminology I would utilize, Pelosi countered, her tone buoyant and sharp. Because it happens to be factual. It undoubtedly is factual, Kennedy concurred, gesturing affirmatively in the manner of an angler stationed by a lake who possessed unlimited time. The United States operates on a free market economy. I deeply appreciate that aspect of her. Here lies my dilemma, Madam Speaker. Both you and your spouse entered the legislative branch earning a respectable wage. Yet, throughout the decades, your household's total valuation escalated continuously until it crested somewhere beyond the $100 million threshold. Now, I am merely a small-town attorney originating from Madisonville. Therefore, assist my comprehension. Did the unrestrained market generate that wealth? Or did the unrestrained market receive a modest degree of assistance from a legislative timetable that absolutely no other citizen in America is permitted to view? The chamber plunged into absolute silence. A journalist occupying the secondary tier ceased typing entirely. Allow me to frame it in the vocabulary my grandfather would have utilized. Kennedy continued, relaxed and entirely devoid of urgency. If I occupy a seat on a panel that is preparing to authorize legislation impacting a corporation on a Thursday, and during the preceding Wednesday my spouse purchases a massive quantity of shares in that exact corporation, and by Friday, the valuation skyrockets. My grandfather would not have labeled that the free market. He would have categorized it as possessing the examination key prior to taking the test. And he would have utilized a much more abbreviated vocabulary word for it than I am permitted to broadcast on the C-SPAN network. A subdued rumble of amusement rippled through the upper deck. The eatery proprietor from Scranton refrained from laughing. He merely angled his posture forward by a fraction. Pelosi shifted closer to her audio transmitter. Here arrived her initial defensive maneuver, and it was a formidable one. She had been navigating these waters since long before John Kennedy ever campaigned for local office. Senator, I do not possess a solitary stock portfolio. I have never held personal stock. My spouse is an enterprise professional. He allocates capital. That activity is entirely lawful. It is strictly reported, and frankly, it is none of your concern, nor is it your place to imply alternative motives. If there existed any impropriety regarding the matter, individuals would face judicial prosecution for it. Nobody has been charged. Therefore, perhaps we can advance beyond this theatrical display. She reclined in her seat. The strike was effective. Several allied representatives on the elevated platform nodded in agreement. She had managed far more intimidating adversaries than this, and she had dismantled them on vastly superior platforms. Kennedy did not recoil. He permitted the quietude to linger for a full 3 seconds, akin to letting a hooked catch exhaust itself before securing the line. That is a highly competent response, he noted. Genuinely, I would have drafted it personally had I been retained as your legal counsel. He allowed the statement to suspend in the atmosphere for an additional moment. However, you entirely bypassed my inquiry. I did not inquire regarding its legality. A multitude of activities are legal. It remains perfectly legal for me to consume an entire pecan pastry while standing beside my kitchen basin at midnight. That does not render it a scenario I would desire to be recorded on film. He placed his spectacles on the desk. I inquired whether it was ethical, and I have observed that whenever I question the ethics, you repeatedly inform me regarding the legality. Those represent two drastically distinct concepts, Madam Speaker. A professional as precise with language as yourself comprehends they are different concepts. Therefore, I intend to pose the question one final time before advancing. Was it ethical? She declined to provide a response to that specific phrasing. She maintained her gaze upon him, and the enduring smirk persisted, yet sustaining it required a visible toll. For a brief span, Pelosi's facial arrangement remained static. She had faced accusations of corruption previously. She had been targeted by countless hostile campaign advertisements. This was standard procedure. However, the atmospheric pressure within the chamber had altered, and an individual of Nancy Pelosi's caliber could detect a shifting environment in the same manner a mariner detects incoming weather systems. Kennedy rotated a page in his materials. Permit me to inquire regarding frozen desserts. A wave of reaction traversed the observers. An individual emitted a laugh, quickly suppressing it. During the springtime of 2020, Kennedy commenced, this nation was brought to its absolute lowest point. Citizens were perishing. Individuals were waiting in queues for multiple hours outside nutritional distribution centers, several of them experiencing this indignity for the initial time in their existence. Honorable citizens who had never requested assistance from anyone. Meanwhile, the legislative branch was battling over financial rescue packages intended for independent enterprises. Do you recall that specific spring season, Madam Speaker? I recall it vividly, Pelosi retorted. I labored relentlessly during that entire duration. I'm entirely certain you did, Kennedy acknowledged. Now, amidst all that chaos, you participated in a nocturnal television broadcast. You positioned yourself before a pair of massive refrigeration units, the premium variety, the models that demand a higher price tag than a pre-owned vehicle. And you unsealed one to reveal to the presenter your vast collection of artisanal gelato, the international imported variety, the $11 per container variety. And you stated, and once more I am strictly quoting you, I am unsure of what my existence would entail had ice cream never been conceptualized. He removed his eyewear. Madam Speaker, are you aware of what the residents in Louisiana were experiencing during that identical week? They were confined to their vehicles in a procession extending half a mile outside a religious institution, anticipating a package of preserved nutritional goods, praying the supply would not exhaust prior to their arrival at the vanguard. Meanwhile, the most commanding female in the legislative branch was broadcasting from her personal culinary space, exhibiting her luxury desserts to the populace. The enduring smirk vanished entirely. You possessed 2 premium units, ma'am, Kennedy appended softly. There sits an individual directly behind you at this moment who was terrifyingly close to forfeiting his commercial establishment during that exact season. He does not possess 2 units. He retained 1, and he was forced to decide between funding its electricity and distributing wages to his staff. Up in the gallery, the Scranton Eatery proprietor lowered his gaze toward his own palms. Senator, Pelosi interjected, and a noticeable sharpness had materialized within her tone, the concealed steel piercing through the exterior velvet. I refuse to express regret for providing a fraction of lightheartedness during the most agonizing era this republic has endured in a generation. The populace required a moment of joy. I offered one. Furthermore, I authored the financial legislation that ensured that individuals' establishment remained operational. If your intention is to debate the concrete actions that placed food on tables, rather than what merely appeared unfavorable on a broadcast, if your objective is to reduce me to a caricature, Senator, append yourself to the queue. The line is vast and ancient, and every participant within it falsely assumed he was the pioneer. The elevated platform fell utterly silent. John Kennedy discarded the rural persona. The Southern cadence remained, but the approachability completely evaporated, and the entire room experienced a sudden plunge in atmospheric warmth. With all due reverence, ma'am, and I state that sincerely, it did not resemble lightheartedness to them. A cheerful expression does not stock a refrigeration unit. You maintained 2 top-tier models, whereas they faced an unoperational deli counter, desperate prayers, and a distribution queue encircling the block. You are free to label it a caricature if it provides you comfort. I categorize it as reality. And the reality dictates that for 4 decades, you have occupied one side of a glass barrier, observing 300 million citizens trapped on the opposing side. You have grown so accustomed to the vantage point that you completely forgot the barrier even existed. You forgot that certain individuals cannot breach the opposing side regardless of their exertion. You never experienced the necessity to push. You were situated on the comfortable side since birth, and you have resided your entire lengthy existence there. And that represents the exact reason you were capable of standing in your culinary space with your luxury desserts and entirely failing to comprehend the agony the remainder of the Republic was internalizing that spring. He had removed the diplomatic constraints, and every soul present recognized the shift. The delivery remained steady, yet an underlying current surged through the observers like raw electricity. The former educator from Ohio held her palm rigidly against her sternum. The young veteran within his mobility device leaned forward to the maximum extent gravity permitted. Pelosi separated her lips to deliver a rebuttal and discovered for an infinitesimal fraction of a second that a prepared statement was absent. A significant duration of time had elapsed since she had experienced such a phenomenon in a public forum. She disguised the lapse in the identical manner she always employed, with a minimized, discarding wave of her hand. However, the lenses had already captured the hesitation. and digital recordings lack the capacity to forget. For the inaugural time that entire afternoon, she extended her reach and aligned the stacked documents resting before her. Her digits located the perimeters. She compressed them together until the corners carved white indentations into the tissue of her thumb. It was a microscopic action. Virtually no observer registered it, yet John Kennedy registered it. He had been anticipating that exact manifestation. The subsequent individual to speak belonged to the Democratic coalition, and that marked the precise instant the trajectory of the inquiry inverted entirely. Representative Marcus Hill of Georgia, an African-American legislator representing an industrious district near Atlanta, an official who had dedicated his complete professional tenure as a steadfast participant of the party apparatus, approached his audio transmitter. He was not designated to be the focal point of the afternoon. His primary function was to remain stationed and defend her flanks, mirroring the protection the coalition had perpetually afforded her, identical to the shelter he had personally provided for years. His vocalization was subdued. "Madam Speaker, prior to the senator proceeding, I wish to contribute a statement, assuming the presiding chair permits it." The chairman nodded his assent. Hill intertwined his fingers. "I was raised in a household where my maternal figure executed 2 separate occupations and still experienced financial deficits during specific months. I have championed this political faction for the entirety of my existence. I have appeared on broadcast networks and defended your personal character more frequently than I possess the capacity to quantify. Therefore, I desire to offer you an opportunity that the senator withheld, because I believe you have accrued at least that courtesy from me." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch. "When the citizens of my district demand to know why a legislative representative is legally permitted to acquire corporate shares the morning preceding a critical committee vote regarding that exact industry, I have never possessed an adequate justification for them. I have exclusively utilized your justification. We are a free market economy. I have regurgitated those exact phrases on the front porches of constituents, generating $30,000 annually. And I have monitored their facial reactions. And I have comprehended in those exact moments that they rejected my premise, and more devastatingly, that they were entirely justified in doing so." His jaw muscles clenched visibly. "I require a superior justification today, permanently recorded, because I am exhausted from transporting that specific burden on your behalf." Pelosi rotated to observe him. Among all the individuals present, his visage was the final one she anticipated to find, directed toward her with such hostility. She had orchestrated his initial subcommittee placement. She had served as the marquee speaker at his financial galas. "Marcus," she addressed him, her tone softening, grasping for the historical allegiance, the political currency that had flawlessly operated in every prior instance. "You are familiar with my character. You understand the benefits I have secured for jurisdictions mirroring yours. You comprehend what I have facilitated for your career." "I am fully aware of your assistance," Hill countered, "and I maintain gratitude for it." "That does not represent the issue at hand." He maintained direct optical contact. "The issue does not revolve around what you have accomplished for us, Madam Speaker. The core issue revolves around what you have retained for your personal gain while executing those duties. You recently listened as the senator questioned you on 4 separate occasions regarding whether the actions were ethical, and on 4 separate occasions, you informed him they were lawful. I possess a maternal figure back in Georgia who strongly desires to hear the alternative vocabulary word." He reclined back into his chair. He did not grant her another glance. A legislator from her own faction, an individual possessing every strategic motivation to shield her, and a documented history of executing that exact defense, had decisively refused to intercept the incoming blade. And no observer present could attribute the fracture to racial divisions, partisan warfare, or regional differences, because the most devastating inquiry of the session had just been delivered by an African-American Democrat she had personally guided. The broadcasting equipment recorded every single frame. In a remote control room, a technical director transitioned to a magnified angle of Pelosi's hands, gripping the documentation, and locked the frame. Kennedy allowed the atmosphere to settle. Subsequently, he leaned back toward his microphone. "I desire to discuss a specific article of stationery," he stated. "February 2020, the State of the Union Address. The Chief Executive concludes his national address, and you are stationed directly in his wake. You grasp your physical duplicate of that exact speech and broadcast it live to the entire nation, You sever it perfectly in half. You subsequently shred it a second time. 3-4 iterations. You reduced it to fragmented debris directly behind his posture. I absolutely did, Pelosi affirmed. She elevated her chin. This represented her fortified territory, and she anchored her stance firmly upon it. This moment would showcase her maximum defensive strength of the session, and she recognized it, grasping for the strategy like a combatant relying on an undefeated combination of strikes. And I would execute the exact action again tomorrow. That address represented a manifesto constructed on falsehoods, page following page of them. I occupied that seat and reviewed every single syllable as he vocalized them. I was incapable of locating a solitary page of factual reality in the entirety of the manuscript. Therefore, indeed, I shredded it. I destroyed it because he destroyed factual reality first. And an individual within that legislative hall was obligated to demonstrate, acting on behalf of the American populace, that we refuse to participate in the charade. Citizens approach me in public spaces to this very moment, senator, everyday citizens, and express their gratitude for that action. They inform me it was the most genuine behavior they have ever witnessed a presiding speaker execute. I harbor zero shame regarding it. I have never experienced a momentary lapse of regret. I felt profoundly liberated. This constituted her primary counteroffensive, and it was the most potent weapon in her arsenal. For 20 agonizing seconds, she commanded the chamber's energy once again. A pair of officials on the elevated platform nodded affirmatively. It was a masterfully constructed rebuttal delivered by a premier architect of political theater and deployed against nearly any alternative adversary. It would have concluded the interrogation instantaneously. Liberated, Kennedy reiterated in a hushed tone. Liberated, she echoed, amplifying her volume, silently challenging him to leverage the terminology against her. And John Kennedy, the small-town attorney, executed the exact maneuver he perfected above all others. He executed absolutely nothing. He refrained from debating. He refused to elevate his volume. He permitted her own terminology to suspend in the geographical center of the room until the reality of the situation became glaringly obvious. He delayed for such an extended duration that individuals commenced awkwardly adjusting their physical postures. He delayed until the concept of liberated had lingered in the atmosphere sufficiently long to spoil entirely. Madam Speaker, he ultimately expressed, you must pardon an uncomplicated individual, but I simply wish to ensure I have transcribed the regulations accurately, as I intend to transport them back to Louisiana and clarify them for my constituents. He tallied the points on his digits with lethargic pacing. Regulation the first. When the chief executive provides you with a manuscript you find distasteful, you are authorized to reduce it to celebratory confetti on live national broadcasting, and that action is deemed courteous and deeply liberating. He elevated a secondary digit. Regulation the second. When a journalist poses a straightforward inquiry regarding your personal family's $100 million fortune, the appropriate rebuttal is free market economy coupled with none of your concern, and noting that individuals would face incarceration if the actions were improper. He gazed upward, peering over his spectacles. Therefore, assuming I am comprehending this correctly, the governing regulations within this republic rely comprehensively upon whose exact fingers are gripping the parchment. When it involves your personal hands, you are authorized to obliterate it and experience profound liberation. When it involves the hands of the general public, they are forbidden from even vocalizing the question. The acoustic environment became so devoid of noise you could audibly detect the mechanical motor of the C-SPAN camera recalibrating its physical mount. And that transitions me to my final point, Kennedy articulated. Following this, I will permit you to depart for your residence, Madam Speaker, because I honor my commitments and I guaranteed brevity. He delved into his tailored jacket and extracted the solitary sheet of paper he had positioned on the desk at the very genesis of the encounter, the sole artifact he had transported into the chamber. The entire audience locked their vision onto it. Following the entirety of the exchange, the refrigeration units, the severed address, the $100 million valuation, observers had begun to deeply hypothesize what was inscribed upon it. Anticipating the explosive revelation the rural attorney had been concealing the entire duration, he uncreased it methodically along its folded boundaries. He refrained from reading the text aloud. He merely elevated it to a height where the broadcasting lens could register that the page was practically blank. Several months prior, the chief executive stood at the State of the Union and demanded that the legislative branch enact a statute prohibiting members from executing financial trades utilizing confidential intelligence, and the entirety of the chamber elevated themselves. Republicans, Democrats, every single individual standing on their feet and applauding. The chief executive surveyed the crowd and verbally inquired, "Did Nancy Pelosi stand up?" Kennedy paused briefly. Now I harbored no intention of referencing that specific event. Political theater remains political theater. However, here is the element that captivated my attention. Subsequently, a journalist operating on the CNN network, a highly sympathetic broadcasting entity, questioned you regarding the moment. They delivered an incredibly gentle inquiry directly down the center. And, Madam Speaker, I analyzed that specific recording on 5 separate occasions. He lowered the document onto the desk. You proved completely incapable of concluding your sentence. Pelosi's jaw muscles contracted severely. You initiated a dialogue regarding the implications the journalist was attempting to extract, and how the underlying actions were entirely devoid of wrongdoing, and how if impropriety existed, individuals would face prosecution, and how you had been attempting to codify this exact legislation, and subsequently you simply... He extended his palm, allowing it to drop openly in the empty space, as if an object had slipped through his grasp. Faded into silence. On your preferred network, confronting your preferred gentle interrogation, delivered by a sympathetic individual. You possess the most rapid intellect in the Capitol for 4 consecutive decades. You have politically buried adversaries far sharper than myself utilizing a single sentence while exiting a corridor. Yet, the solitary inquiry in the entire universe you were incapable of completing a sentence about was whether it was ethically sound for you to accumulate vast wealth derived from the statutes you personally drafted. He angled his posture forward, planting his elbows onto the surface. I have analyzed that phenomenon extensively, Madam Speaker. Why were you incapable of concluding that specific sentence? Pelosi's facial tension peaked. This represented the absolute final counterstrike she was required to execute, and she elevated herself to meet it, launching the offensive with every ounce of residual energy remaining within her. Because the inquiry itself is a fabricated snare, Senator, and you are intimately aware of that reality. You harbor zero interest in acquiring an actual response. Your sole interest lies in generating an isolated video clip. You demand a 40-second segment for your electronic fundraising distributions and your subsequent appearance on the Fox network, and you have successfully obtained it. I offer my congratulations. It will resonate exceptionally well among your constituents in Louisiana. Her volume escalated, powerful and authentic, a seasoned predator backed into a corner, and exponentially more lethal due to the circumstance. I have dedicated 40 years of my human existence to this republic. I successfully maneuvered the Affordable Care Act into law when individuals double my physical stature insisted the feat was impossible. I have shielded a higher volume of working-class households than every solitary member of your political faction aggregated together. And I absolutely refuse, I will vehemently refuse, to occupy a seat at this desk and endure a moral lecture detailing the discrepancy between ethical behavior and legal compliance delivered by an individual who artificially adopts a rural accent, equips reading spectacles, and executes a theatrical caricature for the broadcasting lenses while classifying the charade as integrity. She impacted the desk surface once using 2 fingers. You desire to discuss the populace? I legally enshrine protections for individuals that will survive long after every single person occupying this chamber, including yourself, has perished. Therefore, I strongly advise you against lecturing me regarding their well-being. It was a formidable rebuttal. It was, in objective reality, a spectacular rebuttal. In an alternative location, on a different day, clashing against a different adversary, it would have abruptly terminated the entire conflict and dispatched the senator back to his jurisdiction to recover from the damage. John Kennedy simply waited until the final acoustic reverberation decayed against the rear partition. He lacked urgency. He operated perpetually without urgency. That represented the fundamental mystery of his methodology, the core attribute his exaggerated persona effectively disguised. He waited in the manner a homeowner endures a violent summer tempest from the safety of a porch, absolutely confident it would dissipate, absolutely confident he would remain securely seated when the turbulence concluded. "Madam Speaker," he addressed her softly, radiating an almost compassionate tone, "I have never for a single moment challenged the legislation you successfully championed. I fully acknowledge it constitutes a monumental achievement. I would never attempt to strip that legacy from you, and I possess no intention of trying." He paused. "My inquiry does not concern the items you successfully passed. My inquiry strictly concerns the capital you successfully retained. Those represent two entirely distinct categories, and you continuously attempt to hand me the first category while I am actively indicating the second." He flattened both palms against the desktop surface. "And I shall reveal the precise reason you proved incapable of concluding that sentence during the CNN broadcast. It did not constitute a trap. You admitted it yourself. You have navigated away from thousands of political snares. You personally engineered the vast majority of them." Negative. His vocal pitch descended, and the atmospheric pressure of the chamber plummeted alongside it. "You proved incapable of concluding that sentence because, buried deep beneath the 40 decades of influence, and the $100 million valuation, and the dual refrigeration units packed with imported luxury desserts, and the endless public addresses regarding the working class, there remains a tiny, solitary, ethical fragment of Nancy D'Alessandro, the exact identity the young child from Baltimore originated as. And that specific fragment possesses an absolute comprehension of the exact divergence between what constitutes legality and what constitutes ethics. And when those broadcasting lenses were active, and that sympathetic journalist delivered that gentle, unchallenging inquiry, that singular ethical fragment within you reached upward and physically ripped the vocabulary directly from your vocal cords. Because your standard operating procedure would have permitted you to evade. It would have permitted you to redirect. It would have permitted you to repeat free market economy indefinitely. However, it absolutely would not, it physically could not, permit your vocal apparatus to articulate the definitive lie into the open air. You could have registered the acoustic impact of a falling pin 2 chambers away. Kennedy removed his eyewear, collapsed the hinges with agonizing slowness, and deposited them atop his folded document. "Therefore, allow me to vocalize the factual reality on your behalf, since your own vocal apparatus refuses to cooperate, and subsequently, I will permit your departure." He focused his vision upon her, and his expression was entirely devoid of malice, a factor which inexplicably amplified the devastation of the moment. "You shredded a citizen's formal address on a national broadcast, and you categorized the action as courteous. You positioned yourself in your culinary space highlighting dual luxury freezers that the majority of citizens could not afford with 3 years of accumulated savings, and you categorized the action as lightheartedness. You monitored your family's financial empire balloon into figures that the vast majority of Americans will never encounter across 10 subsequent lifespans, explicitly leveraging a chronological advantage that absolutely no citizen outside the perimeter of this complex is ever granted access to, and you categorized it as the free market. And you executed every single fraction of those actions while wearing that enduring, tolerant little smirk, peering downward through a glass barrier at 300 million citizens you have never once, not for a solitary 24-hour period spanning 40 years, been forced to stand shoulder to shoulder with on the opposing side. His delivery had reduced to a borderline whisper, yet every audio receptor in the facility transmitted it with flawless clarity. You did not represent the populace, Madam Speaker. You presided above them. You governed them as subjects. And the singular item you ever truly shredded that carried actual significance, the singular item, was not a physical speech. It was the fundamental concept that within the borders of this republic, there is intended to exist a singular set of governing rules, and that system is intended to apply to the female possessing 2 luxury freezers in the exact identical manner it applies to the male possessing 0. Nobody inhaled. Nancy Pelosi extended her reach toward the stacked documents resting directly before her. Every single occupant within that chamber had witnessed the recorded footage from 2020. Every individual comprehended the destructive capabilities those hands possessed when applied to stationery. Her fingertips gripped the boundaries. The entire chamber leaned forward, anticipating the physical tear. It never materialized. Her digits compressed the corners in unison. They quivered infinitesimally, a microscopic vibration that the magnified broadcasting lens acquired and maintained focus upon. The parchment emitted a singular, brittle rustle within the violently silent chamber, and subsequently her hands simply released their grip. The documents glided seamlessly back onto the desk surface. She did not sever them. She proved entirely incapable of doing so. For 11 consecutive seconds, the most formidable female entity in the timeline of American governance possessed absolutely zero words to offer. The events that materialized next were devoid of immense volume. That constituted the defining characteristic of the moment. That was the specific element no observer would ever manage to erase from their memory. The chamber witnessed zero screaming. The scene lacked the aggressive striking of wooden gavels, the shouting of parliamentary procedures, or the dramatic, enraged exit of a rival senator performing for the media lenses. The reality of what occurred was vastly more subdued than those theatrics, and simultaneously 100-fold more absolute. Representative Marcus Hill of Georgia elevated himself from his seated position. He refrained from vocalizing a single syllable. He collected his portfolio, secured his portable computer resulting in a muted snap, captured by the audio equipment, repelled his chair backward, and navigated toward the lateral exit. He completely avoided establishing visual contact with Pelosi. He forcefully impacted absolutely nothing. He merely evacuated the premises, and the portal sealed shut automatically in his wake. For a suspended duration, the environment remained frozen. Subsequently, a female legislator stationed 2 positions away from Hill's former seat, a coalition member who had aligned her voting record with Pelosi on every pivotal leadership directive for an entire decade, deposited her writing instrument, accumulated her personal effects, and elevated her posture. She mirrored Hill's trajectory through the lateral exit. Following her departure, a male representative located at the furthest extremity of the elevated platform, a veteran loyalist, an official who explicitly owed his coveted committee chairmanship to her influence, stood up entirely devoid of commentary and trailed behind his colleagues. And suddenly, the phenomenon expanded beyond a singular pair of defections. It consumed the entire seating arrangement. Sequentially, lacking any display of hostility, devoid of any theatrical protest, completely avoiding any artificial spectacle, the Democratic members comprising the House Ethics Committee elevated themselves from their respective stations and evacuated hearing room 1100. The sequence featured absolutely zero prepared speeches. No formal declarations were inducted into the official transcript. The sensory experience consisted solely of the abrasive friction of chair supports dragging against the floorboards, the muted rustling of portfolios being compacted, and the rhythmic, devastating acoustics of footwear traversing the carpeting. This was accompanied by the mechanical unsealing and sealing of the lateral portal, opening and closing, opening and closing, opening and closing. As the precise individuals assigned to occupy the space adjacent to Nancy Pelosi and fortify her defenses, exactly as they had fortified them for 40 years, silently and individually concluded that they would significantly prefer to occupy any other coordinate on the face of the earth, rather than be captured on a live broadcast, occupying the space beside her for an additional 60 seconds. They were not deserting her due to underlying hatred. The vast majority harbored deep affection for her, or historically had. They were deserting her because John Kennedy had posed a singular, authentic inquiry, and her own political allies had actively monitored her hands completely fail to sever a piece of parchment. And they universally comprehended, instantaneously and completely devoid of any verbal exchange occurring among them, that the verbal response she proved incapable of providing was a response they could no longer publicly afford to be captured waiting to hear. This did not constitute an evacuation fueled by hostility. An evacuation fueled by hostility would have represented a strategic blessing. Hostility would have instantly transformed her into a persecuted figure, supplying her with a tangible adversary to combat, a specific target to assign culpability to. This constituted an evacuation fueled by profound disgrace. They experienced overwhelming embarrassment, and they were mortified by the prospect of remaining adjacent to her, broadcasted live across national television formats, directly exposed to an audience of 2 million viewers and aggressively expanding. That reality is substantially, devastatingly more severe. Within a span of 90 seconds, the entire Democratic flank of the elevated platform was completely vacant. Seating units rested at chaotic angles where departing individuals had violently shoved them backward in their haste. An abandoned writing instrument slowly rotated toward the precipice of the desk and plummeted to the carpeting without generating a sound. Nancy Pelosi remained entirely isolated at the testimony desk, still clad in her ivory-toned ensemble. The unblemished, intact documents rested directly before her, occupying the exact coordinates where her fingers had abandoned them. The C-SPAN indicator lamp positioned above the presiding official's chair continued to emit a persistent, unblinking crimson glow, the identical manner it had glowed to document every major victory of her political tenure, flawlessly capturing this specific moment as well. The presiding chairman, an official who visibly projected a desperate wish for the floorboards to spontaneously fracture and consume him entirely, shifted toward his audio transmitter and softly declared the hearing to be in a state of recess. The solitary impact of the wooden gavel served as the most deafening acoustic event in the entire chamber. John Kennedy collected his solitary document, collapsed it back into a quartered configuration, utilizing the pre-existing creases it already possessed, and smoothly deposited it into the interior compartment of his tailored jacket. He did not exhibit a smirk. He completely refrained from pumping his fist in celebration. He did not project the demeanor of an individual who had successfully conquered an adversary. He projected, if anything at all, the appearance of a slightly fatigued and modestly sorrowful individual. The exact visual footprint an honorable person projects when a brutally difficult, factual reality has finally been injected into the public discourse and permanently resists retraction. "I extend my gratitude for your allocated time, Madam Speaker," he expressed. And the peculiar reality, the exact detail the lenses managed to capture, was that his sincerity was absolute. By the precise moment the recess was formalized, the video segment had already saturated the digital ecosystem. The C-SPAN transmission, which on an exceptionally successful afternoon commanded an audience of a few thousand spectators, had eclipsed the 2 million concurrent viewer threshold. Before 60 minutes elapsed, the specific footage capturing her hands retreating without tearing the parchment had accumulated a higher view count than any legislative inquiry in the history of the broadcasting network. Cable television directors aggressively interrupted their scheduled afternoon transmissions. Even the journalistic entities that historically adored her broadcasted the sequence primarily because alternative content ceased to matter. The visual symbolism was excessively pristine. A political titan who had constructed half her mythology by physically shredding a presidential address, currently sitting completely paralyzed, totally incapable of severing a solitary sheet of paper. Stationed outside the perimeter of the Longworth facility, a journalist intercepted Marcus Hill upon the exterior staircase and questioned his motivation for abandoning the session. He halted his momentum, processed the inquiry, and delivered a singular statement. An individual posed an authentic question. I did not possess a sufficiently deceptive answer to justify remaining in the room. Subsequently, he entered his transport vehicle. Nancy Pelosi departed the facility via a secondary lateral exit. The location was entirely devoid of recording equipment, which represented the explicit objective. She had invested 40 years mapping the precise coordinates of every solitary camera stationed within the Capitol, and for this specific instance, she leveraged that exact intelligence to locate the singular corridor completely devoid of observation. Back inside the vacated hearing chamber, a custodial worker named Earl entered the space to evacuate the waste receptacles. He discovered the testimony desk resting in the exact configuration she had abandoned it. The arrangement of documents rested there, completely horizontal and entirely unblemished, not a singular fracture in any page. Earl had maintained that specific facility for 19 consecutive years. He had witnessed every titan of industry and politics arrive and subsequently vanish. He retrieved the documents, aligned them with geometric precision, and deposited them onto the presiding chairman's workstation in preparation for the subsequent morning. Following that, he severed the electrical illumination, and room 1100 descended into absolute darkness, and the solitary surviving artifact belonging to the most heavily influential female figure in the chronicles of American governance was a compressed stack of paper she found herself psychologically paralyzed to destroy.